The sun was scorching overhead as Jamal walked down the street, minding his own business. He had just grabbed a smoothie from a local cafe, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of nowhere, the piercing sound of sirens cut through the air. Within seconds, two police cruisers swerved onto the curb, and officers jumped out, their hands already on their belts. Before Jamal could even process what was happening, he felt a rough grip on his arm. "Put your hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked. Confused, Jamal raised his hands, his smoothie slipping from his fingers and splattering onto the pavement. The officers weren't interested in explanations. They grabbed him, forcing him to the ground as the cold steel of handcuffs lopped around his wrists. Bystanders stopped, some pulling out their phones, but no one stepped in. Jamal struggled to find his voice. "What's going on?" "I didn't do anything," he protested, his heart pounding. "You fit the description of a suspect," one of the officers snapped, tightening the cuffs. Jamal knew better than to resist, but frustration boiled inside him. He had been through this before, wrong place, wrong time. He kept his cool, knowing there was one thing he could say that might change everything. Through clenched teeth, he muttered, "You might want to check my ID first." The officers exchanged glances but didn't seem concerned. They yanked his wallet from his pocket and flipped it open. But the moment they saw his last name, everything changed. Their smug expressions faded, replaced by something else: shock, maybe even fear. One officer swallowed hard before looking at his partner. This can't be right," he mumbled. Jamal locked eyes with him. "It is." The air around them grew thick with tension, because in just a few seconds, these cops would realize they had just arrested the last person they should have ever laid hands on. Continue the story from the previous section and write that explore the main conflict in depth. Develop subplots and dive into different angles or perspectives, but keep the tension building. Don't resolve any of the major conflicts yet, and keep the suspenseful tone while ensuring the story remains engaging. Use relevant keywords naturally. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also, make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI generated. Also, don't create violated content, which can affect YouTube policy. One of the officers stepped away, pacing slightly as he kept glancing between Jamal and the ID in his hand. His mind was racing, trying to figure out the best way to handle this before things spiraled out of control. The other officer still had a firm grip on Jamal's arm, but his hold had loosened noticeably, a clear sign of hesitation. The situation had taken a turn they hadn't expected, and now they were scrambling. The murmurs from the crowd were growing louder. People were whispering, speculating, their phones still pointed at the scene. Some were already posting online, and within minutes, the video would be everywhere. A few brave bystanders even stepped forward, demanding answers. Why is he being arrested? What did he do? Someone shouted. Jamal remained calm, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone around him. The officers were caught between their instinct to maintain control and the realization that they might have just made a career-ending mistake. A few feet away, a young woman in a business suit was furiously typing on her phone. She had recognized Jamal the moment she saw him, and she wasn't wasting any time. Within seconds, the message was sent. Somewhere across the city, in a high-rise government building, a phone buzzed on a mahogany desk. The name on the screen was one that couldn't be ignored. Back at the scene, the officer with the radio spoke up again, his voice tense. "We need to confirm his identity before we do anything else," he said to his partner, but his tone lacked confidence. He already knew they had messed up, but saying it out loud was another thing entirely. Jamal watched their growing unease. He had been in situations like this before, times when people underestimated him, judged him before they even knew who he was. But this time was different. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was about power, perception, and the kind of consequences that came when people in authority abused it. The tension was thick, the weight of what was coming hanging over them like a storm cloud. The officers were waiting for confirmation, but Jamal knew the moment the truth fully landed, their worlds would shift. Because once his father got involved, there would be no walking away from this. The street was dead silent, except for the hushed murmurs of the crowd. The officers stood stiffly, their bodies tense, as if bracing for impact. The man in the suit, still radiating authority, took a step closer. His presence alone was enough to make them second-guess every decision they had made up to this moment. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The weight of his silence was enough to make the officers shift uncomfortably. Jamal exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He could feel the shift in power, how quickly the tables had turned. Just minutes ago, he was another suspect in their eyes, someone they assumed they could push around without consequence. But now they realized they had made a mistake they couldn't take back. The first officer cleared his throat, gripping the radio at his shoulder as if it could somehow shield him from the reality of the situation. "Sir, wait." "I told you not to speak," the man in the suit interrupted sharply, his eyes locked onto the officer. "You had no right to detain him. No probable cause. No justifiable reason. And yet you threw him in cuffs like it was second nature." He let the words hang, giving them a moment to sink in. "Tell me, officer, how do you plan to justify that?" The second officer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He knew there was no excuse. No reasonable explanation for what they had done. The weight of the mistake pressed down on them, heavier than the badge on their chests. The crowd began inching closer, phones still recording, waiting for the moment that would either seal the officer's fate or give them a way out. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. There was no easy way out of this. Jamal's father crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I've already spoken to the precinct," he said coolly. "Your captain is expecting my call. And trust me, he's not happy." The first officer paled. "Sir, You don't get to explain your way out of this." The man cut in again, his tone sharper this time. "Not this time." The tension was suffocating now. The officers knew what was coming. They could feel it, sense it. Their careers, their reputations, everything they had built, hung in the balance. And the worst part, there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop what was about to happen next. A crackle from the police radio broke the heavy silence. The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. "All units, immediate response needed at." The message cut off as the first officer instinctively reached for the device, his hands trembling slightly. But before he could say anything, another voice interrupted, one that made both officers freeze. "This is Captain Reynolds. Officers Harper and Diaz, stand down immediately. Bring the suspect in." The words sent a ripple through the air. Jamal's father raised an eyebrow, his expression cool, but Jamal could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Calculation, concern. The officers looked at each other, confusion written all over their faces. "But sir, the situation has changed." The first officer stammered, gripping the radio like a lifeline. "There's been a misunderstanding, and—" "Stand down." The captain's voice was unyielding, final. Jamal narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. He had expected the captain to call in, but not like this. Not with this urgency. His father seemed to sense it too. "You're making a mistake," his father said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You and I both know my son hasn't committed a crime. So why are you still trying to take him in?" Neither officer answered. The second one finally unlatched Jamal's cuffs, but instead of stepping back, he exchanged a look with his partner, one that spoke volumes. They weren't off the hook yet. Jamal rubbed his wrists, his gut tightening. If his father was here, if the captain was involved, this should have been over. But instead, it felt like the real fight was just beginning. Then another car pulled up. A sleek black SUV, unmarked but unmistakably official. The back door swung open, and out stepped a woman in a crisp suit, her expression unreadable. The moment the officers saw her, they stiffened, standing at attention. Jumal's father tensed beside him. "This just got interesting," he muttered under his breath. The woman adjusted her sunglasses, glancing at Jamal before turning her gaze to the officers. "You two," she said, her voice cool and detached. "You're coming with me." The crowd murmured louder now, phones still recording. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. Because now, the question wasn't whether he was free to go. It was why someone higher up wanted these officers gone. Jamal watched as the two officers hesitated, their faces pale. The woman in the suit, the one who had just arrived, tilted her head slightly, waiting. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Something about her presence told everyone she wasn't here for negotiations. "Protocol." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're calling it?" She pulled a tablet from her bag, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward them. Both officers stiffened. Whatever was on that screen, it was enough to make them go silent. Jumal leaned slightly, trying to catch a glimpse, but the woman turned the device back before he could see. His father, however, seemed to understand immediately. He exhaled sharply, his hands sliding into his pockets, watching the officers like a predator assessing its prey. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," his father said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that sent a chill down Jamal's spine. Officer Diaz took a step back, as if suddenly realizing the ground beneath him was crumbling. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered. The woman sighed. "It never is," she muttered before gesturing toward the SUV. "Get in." The crowd erupted into whispers. Some people were still recording, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. This was bigger. Jumal glanced at his father, waiting for some kind of explanation. But before he could ask, another voice cut through the air, a voice Jamal hadn't expected to hear again. "You think this is over?" Jamal turned sharply. His breath caught in his throat. Captain Reynolds was stepping out of a second black SUV, his expression cold. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't scrambling to explain himself like the officers. He looked prepared. Jumal's father's jaw tightened. The woman in the suit turned toward Reynolds, her expression unreadable. Reynolds took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Jamal's father. "You think you've just cleaned this up." He let out a humorless chuckle. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into." Jamal felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning.